Welcome back to another episode of the IFC's Individuation podcast. I'm Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai. With me today, the usual wrecking crew. It's Dr. Eric Tomlinson and Dr. Lisa Hong with us. And we are back in the search. Or are we searching? I don't think we're searching as much as we are journeying through von Franz's fairy tales. We're calling her fairy tales because she's the one, we're reading them the way she lays them out in her book. So these are ancient fairy tales. We're talking about the unconscious. We're talking about the conscious mind. We're talking about ego. We are talking about persona. We are talking about shadow. And we are talking about mental health. And with that, I would just like to address the Will Smith, Chris Rock slapping. Clearly, Will Smith was triggered. Clearly, he was triggered. That means he suffers from trauma. And that was a reaction to trauma. You're not in your right mind anymore when you react to trauma. That's all I wanted to say about the slapping. But you're not in your right mind. You're not in a space where you're communicating with your conscious ego anymore. You are working from the path of the trauma. You are working from the feeling tone of the trauma. The trauma is your guide. The trauma is the driver. And the trauma is gonna tell you how to act out. So you're acting out of the trauma. It is the part that's dictating your movement. And that's why that looked very strange. The whole event looked very, very strange. Even Chris Rock was like, did Will Smith just slap me? Because it's a dissociative state. He wasn't in his right mind. You could tell from his eyes. You could tell when he sat down, he was still trying to like find himself, and he couldn't find himself. If you just take a glance at his eyes for a couple of seconds, he dissociated. He was not in his conscious mind. And so that's a reaction, that's a trigger, that's a trauma. And that's why we talk about Jungian advanced motor processing. That's why we talk about JAMP. That's why we talk about getting treatment for trauma. Because somebody else takes over. Somebody else takes the wheel and drives the car. And in this case, in front of 25 million people around the world. Somebody else takes over, somebody ends up in the driver's seat. And there's like outrage, explanation, rationalization, but we know what trauma looks like, and we know dissociative impact. We know dissociation. Dissociation, if you're looking at somebody and you don't see them, you say things like, where did you go? If you don't see them, which means that look in their eyes, they're gone somewhere else, then they're disassociated. And he was completely disassociated the entire time. Even afterwards, he was still disassociated. When he came out and gave his speech, he was disassociated. He was talking about his mother and her knitting circle. And she didn't come out with him to the Oscars. He just won the Oscar for Best Actor. And he won it for a role that promotes two legends of the game, two African-American women, Serena and Venus. And it was the entire time, not to blame him, this is because he was triggered, he was dissociated. And that's why I think that there's an overreaction towards the aggression. I think there's an overreaction, but that's just me. I think there's a huge overreaction. I think this is about mental health. I think this is about mental health because we've been locked in a state of isolation and panic for almost 2 years now, coming up on 2 years. And people are not the same. Trauma has taken over. Those who haven't been traumatized are traumatized. Those who were traumatized in the past are being triggered constantly because of the stress, because of the feelings of pressure, because of the unknown. Because, Will Smith's history is that his father used to beat his mother. And he was helpless. Him and his wife are having problems. So his mother didn't go with him to the Oscars. There were many factors that set up the ease of the trigger taking over, where the trigger just engaged automatically. So we need to think about mental health. We need to think about treatment. This is why we think about treatment. And I feel for Chris Rock because he was doing his job. Even though he was poking, but I still feel for him. That's his job. With that, we're going to dive into another story of Mary Louise von Franz's Archetypal Symbols in Fairy Tales with the Hero's Journey. And today, we are going to get into the King of the Golden Mountain. Before that, Dr. Eric, Dr. Lisa, would you like to say hello today?
Greetings, everyone, all listeners and participants.
Every time I do it, I think I'm not going to do it again, but I do it again. Every time I'm like, why did I give him the segue? No, okay.
and have some Tranya. And I hope you relish it as much as I.
Okay. Okay. Why don't we start? This is a Grimm's fairy tale. And who's going to start us off today?
I'll start us off today.
Okay, Dr. Lisa, go for it.
Yeah. All right. This is in The King of the Golden Mountain. A certain merchant had 2 children, a son and a daughter, both very young and could not yet walk. 2 richly laden ships of his sailed forth to sea with all his property on board. Just as he was expecting to win much money by this action, news came that they had gone to the bottom, and now instead of being a rich man, he was a poor one, and had nothing left but one field outside of town. In order to drive his misfortune a little out of his thoughts, he went out to a field, and as he was walking forwards and backwards in it, a little black mannequin stood suddenly by his side and asked why he was so sad, and what he was taking so much to heart. Then said the merchant, if thou couldst help me, I would willingly tell thee. Who knows, replied the black dwarf. Perhaps I can help thee. Then the merchant told him that all he possessed had gone to the bottom of the sea, and that he had nothing left but this field. Do not trouble thyself, said the dwarf. If thou wilt promise to give me the first thing that rubs itself against thy leg when thou art at home again, and to bring it here to this place in 12 years' time, thou shalt have as much money as thou wilt. The merchant thought, what can that be but my dog? And did not remember his little boy. So he agreed and gave the man a written and sealed promise and went home. When he reached home, his little boy was so delighted that he tottered up to him and seized him fast by the legs. The father was shocked, for he remembered his promise, and now knew that he had pledged himself to do so. As he still found no money in his chest, however, he thought the dwarf had only been jesting. A month afterwards, he went up to the garret, intending to gather together some old tin to sell, and saw a great heap of money lying there. Then he was happy again, made purchases, became a great merchant than before, and felt that his world was well governed. In the meantime, the boy grew tall. and at the same time clever. But the nearer the 12th year approached, the more anxious grew the merchant. One day, his son asked what ailed him, but his father would not say. The boy, however, persisted so long that at last he told him that, without being aware of what he was doing, he had promised him to the black dwarf and had received much money for doing so. He said likewise that he had set his hand and seal to this, and since 12 years had now passed, he would have to give him up. Then said the son, "Oh, father, do not be uneasy. All will go well. The little man has no power over me." The son had himself blessed by the priest, and when the time came, father and son went together to the field, and the son made a circle and placed himself inside it with his father. Then came the little black dwarf and said to the man, "Hast thou brought with thee that which thou had promised me?" They spoke for a long time, and at last they agreed that the son, as he did not belong to the archenemy, nor yet to his father, should seat himself in a small boat floating on water that was flowing away from them, and that the father should push it off with his own foot, and the son should remain at the mercy of the waters. So the boy took leave of his father, placed himself in a little boat, and the father had to push it off with his own foot. The boat soon capsized, so that the keel was uppermost, and the father believed his son was lost and went home and mourned for him. The boat, however, did not sink, but floated quietly away, and the boy sat safely inside as it floated for a long time, until at last it touched down at an unknown shore. There the boy went to shore, saw a beautiful castle before him, and set out to reach it. But when he entered, he found that it was bewitched. He went through every room, but all were empty, until he reached the last, where a snake lay coiled up. The snake, however, was an enchanted maiden, who rejoiced at seeing the boy and said, "Hast thou come, O my dear deliverer? I have waited already 12 years for thee. This kingdom is bewitched, and thou must set it free." "How can I do that?" he inquired. "Tonight, 12 black men covered with chains will come. They will ask what thou art doing here. Keep silent, give them no answer, and let them do what they will with thee. They will torment thee, beat thee, stab thee. Let everything pass, only do not speak. At 12 o'clock, they must go away again. On the second night, 12 others will come. On the third, 24, who will cut off thy head. But at 12 o'clock, their power will be over. And then, if thou hast endured all and hast not spoken the slightest word, I shall be released. I will come to thee and will have in a bottle some of water of life. I will rub thee with that, and then thou wilt come to life again and be as healthy as before." Then said he, "I will gladly set thee free." And everything happened just as she said. The black men could not force a single word from him, and on the third night the snake became a beautiful princess, who came with the water of life and brought him back again. She threw herself into his arms and kissed him, and there was joy and gladness in the whole castle. After this, their marriage was celebrated, and he was the king of the Golden Mountain.
They lived happily together, and the queen gave him a beautiful boy. When 8 years had passed, the king remembered his father, and he wished to visit him. The queen wanted to prevent it because she suspected misfortune, but she finally agreed. She gave him a ring which would take him to any place he wanted, but he had to first promise not to use it to wish her, his wife, away from her kingdom to his father. He promised and then wished himself back home. In a moment, he found himself outside his hometown, but the guard would not let him in because he was wearing strange and yet rich and splendid clothes. So he exchanged them with those of a shepherd and went to his father, who did not recognize his son because he thought him long dead. When the son showed his parents a hidden birthmark, they finally believed him. He told them of his kingdom and his wife and son. The father demurred that a king would not go about dressed in rags. Then the son became angry and turned the ring, wishing his wife and son to come to him. The queen came, but silently wept over the broken promise. He told her he had been careless and had no evil intent, and although she accepted, she pondered revenge. He led her to his father's field and showed her the spot where the boat was turned adrift the river. Then he fell asleep with his head in her lap. She took the ring from his finger and, holding her child, wished them back to her kingdom, leaving only a slipper behind. When he woke up, finding himself alone, he said to himself he could not return to his father's house because they would not believe him to be a sorcerer. He decided to go whatever the path takes him to find his wife and child in the kingdom. He came to a mountain in front of which 3 giants were fighting each other over an inheritance. They called him to make a decision because little people have sharp wits. The inheritance consisted of a sword that obeyed the command, all heads off but mine, a cloak that made the bearer invisible, and a pair of boots that would take one to whatever one so desired. He asked the giants if he could try out the 3 things. At first, they would not be fooled, but then he promised not to use them against the giants, and so they agreed. He tried them all, and with the boots on, wished to be taken to the kingdom of the Golden Mountain. He was immediately transported there, where he discovered that his wife was celebrating her wedding with another man. He put on the coat that makes one invisible and ate everything off her plate and drank her glass empty. Dismayed and ashamed, she arose and went to her chamber and wept, but he followed her there. She said, "Has the devil power over me, or did my deliverer never come?" Then he struck her in the face and said, "Did thy deliverer never come? It is he who has thee in his power, thou traitor. Have I deserved this from thee?" Then he made himself visible, went into the hall, and cried, "The wedding is at an end. The true king has returned." The kings, princesses, and counselors who were assembled there ridiculed and mocked him, but he did not trouble to answer them and said, "Will you go away or not?" On this, they tried to seize him, but he drew his sword and said, "All heads off but mine." And all the heads rolled on the ground, and he alone was master and once more king of the Golden Mountain.
Okay.
That's quite a story.
Yeah, it's a really deep story. It's an interesting story. It's a story about the golden son. The golden son. He's the 12th son. He's given up on his 12th year. 12th in the horoscope. The 12th son. The 12th son is the perfect son. He completes all the astrological signs, according to Von Franz. What else about the story did we like? What kind of themes did we? So there's loss. There's a sense of that I found a solution, and I would have to trade something very important to me for that solution. And I forget that I have something that's very important to me. How did I know that it was that important to me? Why didn't that come to me when I was making that decision? Did I not take that into context? Did I forget? Was it convenient to forget? Did I forget my son? I just thought my dog was the only thing I had. That's one of the questions I have. Why did he forget the son? So in the fairy tale, usually when you are seeking something, you have to give something up that's valuable. This has been kind of a rolling theme, right, Lisa? We've been going through this theme. If you want something, you have to give something up of more value. to you. You could ask for whatever you want, but you have to give something of deep value to you or more value to you. So if you want like 10 castles and billions of dollars, you have to give up your son.
I think they call that something like a deal with the devil.
Yes.
Mhm.
Tell me more about deals with devils.
Oh, where your selfish desires are put ahead of the consequences of the decisions and the sacrifices you have to make.
Yeah, I mean, payday loans, deal with devil. There's many deals with devils that a lot of people have for you. Just remember, deals with devils. You see them all the time. They're always hacking something. There's always something they want to hawk off on you. They tell you all kinds of things. It can make you younger, more virile, stronger, more masculine, more attractive,
Powerful.
more powerful,
It's
richer.
it's interesting, Dr. Lahab, because the one of the things that Denzel Washington said to, said to him before he went up to accept his Oscar.
Will Smith.
Yeah, he said to Will Smith, I don't remember the exact verbiage, but in essence, it was this point. It was, be careful, when you're at your highest, because that's when the devil will come.
Yeah.
He said that to him.
Yeah.
After he slapped Chris Rock.
Yeah. It's good advice that's late. But hey, stuff happens, and he did not use the warning in his speech and apologize to Chris Rock. He continued. He continued on his path because he was triggered.
Yes, he was.
And because he was not in his conscious mind,
and my relational point is that something triggered this man, the merchant. Something triggered him when he saw what he was going to be able to get, to the point where he was dissociated from his son. He wasn't even thinking about him.
That's an interesting interpretation. So that so if you grew up really poor and you grew up with nothing, and a great deal of wealth would solve your problems and make you feel better about the world. Because when you grow up with nothing, you can't buy food, you can't buy clothes, you can't buy things that everybody else can buy who has money. So the world is a very, very difficult place because you have no resources, you have no power in the world. And to be powerless in the world is a traumatic journey. I mean, both of these young men, Chris Rock and Will Smith, grew up lower middle class with working parents, under a lot of stress, trying to make it. And so these kids witnessed all that happened. So you grow up with that, as Dr. Eric was talking about, and as the merchant was triggered by this offer. And with that trigger, he dissociated that he would have to give up something that's worth more, which would be his son. But obviously, because of the trauma of poverty and the trauma of not having anything, taking that deal with the devil, in this case a dwarf, was what he needed to do. Okay, so this is the first part. He makes a deal with this devil. this demon, this creature who feeds on the energy of the young and hoards gold. Gold is also a symbol of the sun. It's a symbol of energy. Gold is yellow like the sun. So it's a symbol of the god or goddess. It's the symbol. That's why it's divine. That's why we seek out gold. That's why gold is, we have always given it archetypal value. We have always chased after it. It's always meant something to us, even when we knew nothing about it. Way before time started, we sought it out. These are archetypal. These are archetypal symbols. This is what we chase. So then he's trying to enjoy his life, but every year that goes by gets closer to the time that he has to give up his son. So what happens in that part of the story? What happens, Lisa?
I see lots of people with different histories of different fears of losses.
Yeah, yeah.
There's the boy who you know,
He sends him down river.
Hmm?
He sends him down river in a boat.
Mm.
And what is he trying? He's afraid to lose him, and he forces the loss. He creates a different type of trauma.
Yeah.
Where I can't suffer the loss. So I create a catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, the merchant's afraid of facing the consequences of breaching a contract. So he gives up his son. The son is going home to seek validation, going back to his father, and is instantly insulted. And in that he makes a terrible decision. It seems the wife is afraid of losing her something. She has a backstory there where she makes this requirement.
Well, it's what's given when you use magic. You have to give something up.
Mm.
So to use the magic, you cannot use it on this issue, and this issue alone. You cannot ask for me to leave.
Mm-hmm.
That's the prerequisite of using the magic ring. So he breaks the prerequisite, he breaks it, right? And this is where when you're traumatized and you get triggered. So he goes back to see the father, and he's talking to the father, and suddenly he realizes that this man is not as caring or loving as he thought he was. He didn't react to him the way he expected him to react to. He didn't open his arms. He didn't welcome in it. It was more of like, oh, this was a trauma for me, and you're dead. Right? And I have to live with my miserable life, even though I caused that to myself. This is intergenerational trauma. Mm-hmm. This is how it works out. And this is where he comes back to his father's house, and then again, he's insulted and triggered. And therefore, he causes another trauma to somebody else, to his wife and child. So this is what happened at the Oscars. Intergenerational trauma coming back to haunt you. Coming back for victory lap. I did it. Look, Mom, I did it. Did not work out that way. Not to make light of what happened. I do feel bad for both of the young men. They don't deserve it. But this is trauma. There's no need to go into too much about what happened. This is a trauma, and this is a reaction to trauma. This is what a trigger is. Because you could see that he was conflicted. He laughed about it and then realized that offended the other person, and then he reacted. And then he was like in out of control. It was like, I don't think he knew exactly what he was going to do. So the 12th son, he is the one who's supposed to break the traumatic path. There's always somebody, a child is born, a son, a daughter in the family to break the path that the family has been walking, driving, running. There is always one. That's the 12th son. Any thoughts? Lisa, Dr. Eric?
It's just amazing to me that he wound up basically becoming a murderer, estranged from his wife. All the leaders that were mocking him are now beheaded. And then once more, he is king of the Golden Mountain. What looked like a really promising beginning ends in tragedy in some ways. I mean, I know.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Mm-hmm.
And I know on some level he's supposed to be the hero of the story, because he did overcome some things, but then he quickly succumbed, which is what Denzel said: be careful when you get it all, be careful when it's all there, you rise to the top, because that's when it'll come after you. So another parallel.
Well, yes, because trauma is intergenerational.
Yeah.
This is what happened to his father. His father thought he won it all. And then he lost it all. And then it was his turn to win it all. You have to work out the trauma to move forward. You cannot move forward without working out through the trauma. The trauma is the block. The trauma is the locked door. The trauma is the glitch. The trauma is the thing that keeps pushing you to the edge. So every time you walk away from the edge, it pushes you back to the edge.
One thing that's interesting to me, Dr. Lahab and Dr. Lisa, about that point is, some people are different. Some people are able to relatively compartmentalize their trauma, and then they can wind up still being functional. But the thing about the trauma is, even though it's compartmentalized, it never stops working. It never stays still. Yeah, you may have some walls up around it, keep it in a relatively confined space, but it always finds ways out.
Especially when you're excited about your night out, you're going to win a big award. You're going to see your accomplishments come to fruition. You're going to see the accolades that you have been fighting for come through. You're anxious, you're worried that something might go wrong. That's the trauma. The trauma is that something might go wrong. I hope something doesn't go wrong. I can bet you something's going to go wrong. Something, the worst thing you can imagine is going to go wrong. You're going to walk up on stage and slap Chris Rock. It's going to go wrong. That's what's going to go wrong. That's what because the trauma is always, as Dr. Eric says, is always at play.
Mm-hmm.
Its energy is always in the background. Sometimes it sounds like static. Sometimes it sounds like a hum. Sometimes it sounds like a clawing. And sometimes it sounds like a bad garage band.
And sometimes it sounds like a lot of voices, a lot of your own voices telling you, talking to you at the same time.
That's the garage band. That's where everybody's yelling your name. And so trauma and the treatment of trauma. The solution to the problem is the treatment. Don't go to the Oscars if you haven't been jammed. It's a very simple solution. We could help you with that. Will, did you get jammed this year? You know, last year you didn't work out so well. Go see Dr. Lahab. Get jammed, Will.
It would have helped him. There's no doubt about that.
No, he would have felt better.
Yeah, he would have.
He would have felt better. That wouldn't have happened. I can tell you that.
No, it wouldn't.
That would not have happened. Because with Jungian advanced motor processing, it disarms the trigger. So he would have walked in, the trigger mechanism would have been disarmed. So even if the joke broke and he was irritated, he might have had a frown on his face, but he wouldn't have reacted in that way. You could have had gave him a look or said something, but that reaction, you could tell is a dissociated reaction. You could tell he was on automatic. That's why it's dissociated. That's why you're on cruise control. And people with trauma go through large parts of their day on cruise control.
That's really true.
So that's why we always talk about treatment and the importance of treatment for just not overreacting to situations. But that's not an overreaction. That's a triggered response. An overreaction is conscious. I overreacted. I'm conscious that I overreacted. I created that. I wanted to overreact. There's a difference. When it's dissociated, I was not in charge of the whole scene. I thought I was. I tell myself I was. I even argue with myself, like, yeah, no, I knew what I was doing, because I have to rationalize it somehow that I had control. Like, I didn't do that, and I was not in control of that. How could I not be in control of that? Well, it's because of the trauma, right? It's because of the initial trauma. It's because of the trauma long ago that was, as Dr. Eric says, compartmentalized. Just because it's compartmentalized does not mean that it doesn't come out. It just means you think you got it trapped somewhere. That's all that means. So the term compartmentalized means you think you have it contained.
Right.
Not contained.
Nope.
So we like to use the term because it makes us feel like we're in more control. We're not in that much control. That shows the fallacy of control. And that's why part of the treatment for trauma is because the fallacy of control is that whatever happens, I'm in control of. Well, we know that's not true. There's a lot of things that happen on automatic. You eat, you drink, you fall asleep, you wake up, go about your day, you have another cup of coffee, you go do this, you go see a friend, you go to the bathroom, you go out to dinner, you walk in the park. You could spend 90 days and then go, what happened to February, March, and April? We're in May already. Cruise control. And so when we're presented in situations where there's high emotional stakes, there is high emotional betting going on those stakes, because there's a lot of people involved. It's all my demons are involved. My internalized parental imagos, mommy and daddy. The people that I thought are important, my teachers, those who have helped me in the world, all of those are talking to me at the same time. They're telling me how great or how terrible I am. Mm-hmm. How much I've achieved, or yet I haven't really, I've gotten away with it. I've gotten lucky. So if you get like great success, then that voice comes out as you've been lucky. Hey, you've been lucky, you know, you're not really that good. To the contrary, Will Smith is a superstar. But it's those nagging, traumatic voices in the background that eat away at you. They're the ones who take your feet away from you. They are Denzel's, the devil coming after you. The devil is always inside, the devil's not outside. And the devil is in the form of a trauma. So the man who goes out to find a living, to find some way to make something happen for himself and his family, ends up sacrificing his family for the thing he wanted to save. His family ends up sacrificing them without knowing. Because it's intergenerational. It's because it's happened over and over again.
Well, and what did his son say right afterwards? He tweeted, what did he tweet? He tweeted, that's what we do.
The intergenerational is unconscious. The trauma plays itself out, and then people start defending actions. But this is about trauma. This is about working through trauma. It's a good moment in time. If we could talk about these issues, Lisa, if we could talk about mental health, if we could talk about growing up with abuse, growing up in conflictual situations and conflictual families, angry families, disrespectful families, commandeering families, dictatorial families, abusive families, whatever family it is. But we need to talk about it. We need to be honest with ourselves and our feeling states. We don't need to scapegoat these two young men. We need to talk, we need to help understand why it happens and how we can help.
You know, Dr. Lahab, I'm glad that you brought up the idea about the effects of trauma putting us in an automatic pilot mode.
Yeah.
Because when I watched the replay of Will walking up the stairs and on the stage, it you know, don't laugh, but I used to watch this. It made me think of a cartoon character. When I was young, I watched this French skunk called Pepe Le Pew.
Mm.
Whenever Pepe Le Pew, whenever a beautiful woman would walk by her, he would smell her perfume, and his body rose up in the air, his eyes closed, and he just followed the waft of scent in the air. He was completely controlled and pulled and driven by it. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of Will. I mean, he was on a mission. He may not have known.
I don't think he knew what he was going to do.
I was getting ready to.
I think he was on automatic. I don't think he was on, and wherever he went, I think he restrained himself. I think there was a part of him that reached down and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because he hesitated.
Yeah, he did.
He was going to do something worse. He was going to punch him or kick him, and he restrained himself. So that went unnoticed because of the event, and everyone was like shocked. Oh, how could he? But you could tell something is wrong here.
Yeah, and he immediately turned and walked away. Started walking.
Even Chris Rock was in shock. Even Chris said, "I was just slapped by Will Smith." It was like I think he sensed Will was not there. I think he sensed he's like, "Hey, you're Will Smith. We're on the Oscars. You just slapped me." Because that's exactly what he said to him. He said, "This is the greatest moment in television history." He was like saying, "Hey, we're on television." It's like, "Hey, dude." I think even Chris noticed that this was a crisis, that he was in crisis, that he wasn't in his. Well, these guys are friends, they're buddies.
Yeah, I think I said I've not followed up on the post-show commentary or anything, but I think I read that Chris hasn't really made a comment or anything about the whole thing.
No.
And that, in a way, that's almost compassionate. I don't know what they do in the personal conversations that they've had, but without,
But he already told the police he wasn't filing any.
They're buddies, Lisa. They're buddies like we're buddies. They're buddies. They hang out together. They go to parties together. They have conversations together. They're friends. Him, Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, Will, Denzel, they're friends. They hang out, they talk. Yeah, there's not that many African-American men who have that kind of status in Hollywood. They're a handful, and that's the handful. That's two of the number ones. I mean, it's like, so it's a small group. So
I think that shows a level of compassion and understanding of that it wasn't about him.
Well, I think P. Diddy came and tried to like clean it up and talk about, he actually, P. Diddy, interesting, but he was actually talking about, it was a moment that shouldn't have happened and we should proceed with love. And he said some things that were a little bit more healing, a little bit more integrated into what happened. You don't let that go on and then not at least try to explore what happened. Like it was an unfortunate event and we had miscommunication. Clearly somebody offended somebody else.
Yeah.
Clearly somebody had their feelings hurt and reacted. But it's a little shocking that they reacted with physical violence on national television. I mean, they could have said it in many different ways. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, interesting week. I hope Will gets. I hope Will reaches out to us and gets some jump. I think he would benefit from it. And I feel 1,000% better. I know he's blaming himself right now and he's completely being victimized by his trauma because he's been traumatized again. As much as it was traumatic for Chris, and I'm sure it was traumatic for him, it was also traumatic for Will. I think he traumatized himself. His behavior, he lost control. But yeah, I hope you reach out.
Yeah, it's a turning point for him because this is going to follow him the rest of his life.
Yeah, so he needs to deal with the trauma so he's able to talk about the event. So the event needs to be, and this is what we talk about of integrating the trauma. The event needs to be seen for what, the altercation that happened. But no longer do I have the emotional charge because that charge of rage has now become embarrassment, shame, disgust, disturbed, dismissed, inadequate, out of control. All these negative type feeling states are being associated with that night. And that has to be resolved right away. That cannot fester. Because that festers, then you can't function really. You're not going to be able to function.
It's funny. Tell me what you think of this. It's funny because, not ha-ha funny, it's odd, peculiar, because a number of people in the media and off the media that reported it in the media are trying to suggest that he had never gotten out of his role as Richard Williams, and that's why he was so aggressive. And yet, Richard Williams he never did that to people.
No, Richard Williams was.
He was the one that was victimized.
He was victimized and traumatized over and over again. He was not physically violent with anybody.
That's right.
No, he was never physically violent with anybody. No.
So that it's really a bad comparison.
Well, no, it's a racist comparison, right? It's like, you're this black man, you have all this rage, and it's stereotyping, it's at the worst of the stereotyping.
Maybe with some, but there were some African Americans saying the same thing, and they weren't
being. Yeah, well, that shows ignorance, right?
Right.
So it's not stereotyping, it's ignorance. But unfortunately, every time we have told, we say of people who are stereotyping that they're ignorant, we are excusing their racism. So, but that's just my point of view. Anyway, with that, this is the IFC's Individuation podcast. We have gone through another story by von Franz. We are very excited by her book. We will return next week and continue with Mary Louise von Franz, Archetypal Stories and Fairy Tales. I am Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai. This is the IFC's Individuation podcast. This is Dr. Eric Tomlinson. That is Dr. Lisa Hong. And we are not afraid.
We are not afraid.
We are not afraid.
See you next week.